The Seminole people are, in the most precise historical sense, survivors. They are the descendants of a coalition of indigenous peoples who came together in the peninsula of Florida during the 18th century from remnant populations of earlier Florida nations, the Muskogee, the Hitchiti, the Miccosukee, the Yuchi, and others whose own nations had been devastated by European disease and colonial violence, and who, when the United States government attempted to remove them to Indian Territory in the 1830s, fought 3 wars across the Florida interior and refused to leave. The Third Seminole War ended not with a treaty, but with exhaustion on both sides. The American military withdrew from the swamps and hammocks of the southern Florida interior, which it had found impassable, and the several hundred Seminole who remained in those swamps and hammocks were never formally defeated, and never formally signed a peace agreement with the United States government. Their descendants, the Seminole tribe of Florida and the Miccosukee tribe of Indians of Florida, are today sometimes described as the only Native American nations never to have signed a peace treaty with the United States. This is a point they make themselves, and it is accurate. The Florida interior that sheltered the Seminole through the wars of removal is a landscape of extraordinary and specific character. The Everglades, which covers roughly 1/3 of the Florida peninsula at its historical extent, is not a swamp in the sense that most people who use the word swamp mean it. It is a river, a shallow, broad, slow-moving sheet of fresh water moving south from Lake Okeechobee toward the Gulf and the Atlantic, through a matrix of sawgrass marsh and tree islands called hammocks and mangrove fringe and open water, over a limestone base whose flatness is absolute in a way that no other landscape in North America quite matches. The limestone is the key. South Florida's geology is essentially a platform of porous oolitic limestone, known as Miami limestone, or oolite in its particular local expression, that was laid down in shallow tropical seas millions of years ago, is barely above sea level at its highest point, and is riddled with dissolution features, sinkholes, caves, solution holes, the characteristic karst topography of limestone terrain that make its surface and its near subsurface an archive of geological and environmental change across timescales that dwarf the human record. The Seminole oral tradition engages with this landscape in the way that traditions develop when a people have lived in an environment for generations, not as background, but as text, with specific places carrying specific meanings and specific histories that are part of the tradition's living knowledge rather than its antiquarian curiosity. In 1899, a man named Clay McAllister, a schoolteacher from a Presbyterian mission near the settlement at Fort Lauderdale, who had spent 4 years learning enough Muskogee to hold limited conversations with Seminole community members who were willing to speak with him, recorded a series of accounts in a journal he kept as a private practice rather than an official document. The journal was inherited by his daughter, who donated it to the Historical Society of Fort Lauderdale, where it has been in the collection since 1951 and has been consulted sporadically by researchers working on Seminole history and on the archaeology of the Florida interior. McAllister was not an ethnologist and did not approach the community with an ethnologist's framework, which is both the limitation and the strength of what his journal contains. The limitation is that he did not have the systematic methodology that would have produced comparable, structured documentation. The strength is that he was not organizing what he heard into the categories that Bureau of American Ethnology fieldwork of this period imposed on its subjects, categories that frequently stripped oral accounts of their internal logic in favor of a classificatory system imposed from outside. What McAllister recorded, he recorded because it interested him, and what interested him he noted in his own words, with his own responses, in a form that preserved the conversation's texture rather than only its content. The man who told him most of what his 1899 journal contains was identified in those pages by a name that McAllister rendered phonetically as something between osprey sitting and the sitting bird, noting that his Muskogee was insufficient to determine with confidence which bird was intended, and that the elder himself had smiled at McAllister's attempt to clarify, which the teacher interpreted as a sign that precision on this point was either unnecessary or deliberately discouraged. The elder was, by McAllister's estimate, in his mid to late 70s in 1899, which placed his birth in the early 1820s, before the wars of removal had concluded, meaning he carried knowledge from a generation that had formed its understanding of the Florida interior in conditions that preceded the most intense period of American military and settler disruption. What the elder described, across several conversations that McAllister recorded over the course of a summer, concerned a period before the present people, which McAllister understood to mean before the Seminole as such, before the coalition that had formed in the 18th century, and therefore before the historical period that any living person could speak to from personal or familial memory. The elder was careful, McAllister noted, to distinguish between things he had been told by someone who had been told by someone, extending back through named generations, and things that existed in the tradition as accounts of a period before any chain of personal transmission could reach. The accounts concerning the Stonemen occupied this second category, deeper than any named chain of transmission, belonging to the time before the time people know, which McAllister rendered in English as the deep before, and which he glossed in a margin note as possibly equivalent in function to what other traditions call primordial or antediluvian time. The stone men were not men made of stone, the elder explained, or rather, McAllister wrote that he explained this, correcting an initial translation that had given that impression. The name referred to their quality of endurance, their property of lasting beyond the time scale of ordinary things. The Muskogee word McAllister attempted to transliterate and then glossed as lasting beyond, or the ones who do not end the way things end. They were builders. Specifically, the tradition's account of them centered on the fact of their building, on what they had made and left behind rather than on their nature or their origin, or their eventual absence, which the elder treated as less interesting than the question of what their presence had produced. What they had built, in the tradition as the elder described it, were roads, not paths, not trails in the sense that human movement through a landscape produces trails, gradual expressions of preference accumulated over time, but roads in the sense of deliberate construction, of material brought and placed and arranged with intention to create a surface that differed from its surroundings in a specific and functional way. The material was stone. In a landscape of limestone and sawgrass in shallow water, a road built of stone was a significant intervention, and the elder was specific about the form this intervention took. Not raised, not elevated above the marsh in the manner of a causeway, but laid into the surface of the ground, fitted into the limestone base so that the road was level with or slightly recessed into the surrounding terrain, rather than standing above it. The word McAllister eventually settled on for this form was Coral Road, adapting the local vernacular for the oolitic limestone of South Florida, which residents and the Seminole community alike often called Coral Rock, because of its porous, biologically derived structure. The coral roads ran, in the elder's account, from places that were now interior to places that were now underwater. This detail McAllister recorded with a notation of his own. "This is peculiar," he wrote, "and I do not know what to make of it." The roads as described did not connect places that were currently meaningful as destinations or origins. They connected places that implied a different configuration of the landscape, a landscape in which the current coastline was further out, in which what was now the shallow coastal shelf and the offshore islands and the reef were dry ground, or at least drier ground, and in which the roads from the interior reached toward a coast that no longer existed in the location the roads had been built to reach. McAllister did not have access to the understanding of sea level change that would, over the following century, establish that South Florida's coastline has moved substantially within the period of human occupation of the peninsula. Sea level has risen approximately 4 to 6 feet since the last glacial maximum, and the Florida coastline has retreated across the flat limestone platform in a way that moved the coast significantly inland over geological timescales. The offshore limestone features that now sit underwater along the South Florida coast include formations bearing the marks of freshwater dissolution, sinkholes and solution holes that only form when limestone is exposed to fresh water rather than salt water, meaning they were above sea level at some point in the past. This is documented geology. The shoreline of South Florida has moved, and the interior was once much closer to a coast that was much further out. The elder did not frame this in geological terms, because he did not have geological terms for it, and because the tradition's account preceded any framework in which those terms were available. What the tradition preserved was the memory, or the memory of a memory, that the landscape had once been configured differently, that what the roads connected had once been connectable, and that the roads were evidence of a time when the connection was worth making. McAllister noted this without drawing the inference that the geological record would eventually make available, because in 1899 he lacked the scientific vocabulary to draw it. What he had was an old man describing roads that went from somewhere to somewhere that was now underwater, in terms of a people who built things that lasted, in a landscape whose limestone base was, even to McAllister's untrained eye, clearly capable of preserving such things for a very long time. The Seminole tradition's account of the stone men as builders rather than as gods or monsters is notable in the context of the comparative archaeology of the region. The Calusa, who occupied South Florida for millennia before European contact, were extraordinary builders in the shell mound tradition, constructing artificial islands, watercourts, and settlement platforms from accumulated marine shell across Tampa Bay and Charlotte Harbor at a scale that startled the Spanish and that subsequent researchers have consistently underestimated. Whether the stone men of the Seminole deep before have any historical connection to the Calusa, or to the people who preceded the Calusa, or represent a memory of a still earlier culture whose material traces lie in water that has since covered them, is a question that the available evidence does not settle, and that the relevant scientific disciplines have not yet asked in a fully coordinated way. McAllister's journal ended when he left the mission in 1901, transferred to a posting in Georgia. He did not, as far as any surviving correspondence indicates, attempt to publish or formally report what his conversations with the elder had produced. The journal entered the Historical Society collection 50 years later, with no specific notation of its potential significance. The elder's name, Osprey Sitting, or the Sitting Bird, has not been matched to any individual in any other historical record of the period. He was a man who knew things that the tradition he carried had preserved across a chain of telling that reached into a time before naming, and he told some of what he knew to a schoolteacher who wrote it down in a private journal. And the journal has been in a small historical society since 1951, unread for years at a time, available to whoever comes looking with the right question. The coral roads, if they exist in the form the tradition describes, stone-fitted into the limestone base of the South Florida interior, running from current inland locations toward what are now submerged features of the offshore shelf, have not been systematically searched for. The archaeology of the South Florida interior is complicated by the Everglades themselves, where survey is conducted under constraints reflecting both ecological sensitivity and the preferences of the Seminole and Miccosukee communities whose ancestors shaped that landscape. What might lie offshore, in deeper water, connected to inland features by stone roads laid before the sea took back the coast, is not something the current research program has reached. The landscape keeps its records in the way limestone keeps records, by preserving the surfaces of things that were once exposed to air and water and the movement of people, and covering them with what comes after, and waiting with the patience of rock for someone to ask what is underneath. McAllister recorded one further detail from his conversations with the elder that he set apart in his journal, with a line drawn above and below it. The way he marked things he considered especially significant, or especially uncertain, or both. The elder had said, and McAllister noted that this part of the account came unprompted, near the end of one of their later conversations, as though the elder had been holding it until he had made some assessment of the schoolteacher that satisfied him. That the coral roads were not the only thing the stone men had left. That beneath certain of the tree islands, the hammocks that rose a foot or two above the surrounding marsh on their limestone bases, and that the Seminole had used as elevated dry ground for camps and gardens and ceremonial sites for generations, there were chambers. Not natural cavities in the limestone, not the ordinary solution holes and sinkholes of the karst, but worked spaces, shaped by hands, with the same quality of deliberate construction that the roads displayed above them. The elder described these chambers as being accessible from specific points on specific hammocks, points that he indicated were known to certain people and not others, and that he was not, he made clear, going to specify to McAllister. The knowledge of where the access points were was itself a form of knowledge that belonged to a category of things not shared with outsiders, regardless of how much Muskogee the outsider had learned or how many summers he had spent asking polite questions. McAllister wrote this down with what reads in his journal as genuine respect rather than frustration. He noted that he understood the withholding, that he thought the elder was correct to withhold it, and that he was recording the existence of the chambers and the fact of the access points without the specific locations, because the existence was the part of the account that served the record, and the locations were the part that served something else, something that was not his to have. The chambers, the elder said, were not empty in the way that caves are empty. They contained things. The elder used a word that McAllister transliterated and then spent half a page trying to define, a word that seemed to mean kept things, or things that are being kept, with a sense in the Muskogee original that the keeping was active rather than passive. Not stored, not abandoned, not simply left behind by people who were gone, but maintained, in some sense that McAllister found difficult to render in English, by the ongoing intention of people who understood that the things required keeping. The analogy the elder offered, and that McAllister recorded with the note that he was not certain the analogy was intended to be taken literally rather than as a way of conveying a category, was of fire kept in a vessel. The fire was not itself the vessel. The vessel was not itself the fire. But the vessel existed for the fire, and the fire would not continue without the vessel. And both together were a single thing that required the attention of someone who understood what it was for. McAllister wrote that he asked, carefully, whether anyone was currently performing this maintenance, whether there were people who went to the hammock chambers and kept what needed keeping. The elder looked at him for a long moment before answering, McAllister recorded, and then said something that the teacher translated as, "Some questions are answered by the fact that the thing is still here." He did not elaborate. McAllister did not press him. They sat for a while in the manner of conversations that have said what they were going to say, and then the elder stood and the session was over, and McAllister walked back to the mission with his notebook and wrote down what he had been given, which was most of what he had been told, and less than what the elder knew, which is the condition of all such records, and which McAllister, in this case, appears to have understood. The Seminole and Makosuke communities of South Florida maintain active ceremonial and cultural programs centered on the specific landscape of the interior. The green corn ceremony has been conducted in the hammocks and prairies of the Florida interior without interruption for centuries, adapting its locations and forms in response to the disruptions of the removal wars and the pressures of settlement and drainage, but persisting in its essential character as a ceremony that renews the relationship between the people and the landscape they inhabit. The hammocks the elder described as containing the chambers of the stone men are precisely the landscape features that the Seminole ceremonial calendar engages with most directly, elevated dry ground in the surrounding marsh, where the land is high enough to stand on and the trees are old enough to have watched everything that has happened around them for centuries. Whether the things the elder described as being kept in those chambers are still being kept, and by whom and in what form, is not a question this account can answer. It is not a question this account was asked. What was asked was what the Seminole said about the stone men who built the coral roads, and what was documented in 1899 by a Presbyterian schoolteacher, whose Muskogee was not quite good enough, and whose attention was better than his language, and what the landscape of South Florida contains that might give those accounts a different kind of weight than myth is usually accorded. The geological record of sea level change gives the roads that weight. The karst formation of the limestone platform gives the chambers that weight. The Calusa's demonstrated capacity for large-scale civil engineering in this precise landscape gives the stonemen that weight. None of it is confirmation. All of it is the record offering itself to a question that has not yet been fully asked. The sawgrass is still there. The hammocks are still there, standing a foot or two above the surrounding marsh on their limestone bases, holding their trees and their soil and their access points and whatever the access points lead to. The coral roads, if they are there, are in the limestone, patient in the way that fitted stone is patient, connecting what they were built to connect across a separation that the sea created, and that no road has yet been built to cross.